Hey, Jeannie, who's our guest on the show today?
Today we have Melissa Whited, Senior Principal at Synapse. Hi, Melissa.
Good morning.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm
I,
excited because Melissa is a premier expert on EV rates and lots of cool stuff that I don't know much about.
So we just released a new fact sheet, a new update to our analysis of how electric vehicles are impacting rates in California. And this new analysis found that for the three major investor-owned utilities in California, over the past decade from 2012 to 2021, EVs have contributed more than $1.7 billion in revenues above the cost that they've imposed on the grid. So this is really big news because obviously additional load imposes costs on the grid. And if that load occurs during peak hours, it can be extremely costly to serve. But what we found by analyzing the times that electric vehicles charge is that they actually charge in beneficial ways for the most part. And so the costs that they impose on the grid, the marginal costs of additional electricity, capacity, distribution, transmission costs, those are all lower than the rates that they've been paying over the past decade. And so that's great news because that means that EVs are putting downward pressure on electricity rates for all customers.
So, how did you get on the road to this analysis, Melissa?
So the Natural Resources Defense Council contacted us a few years back to look at the reports that utilities are putting out with respect to when electric vehicles charge and the costs that they're imposing on the system relative to the revenues that they're generating. So we conducted this analysis on behalf of NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, for the past few years. And this is our 2022 update.
Awesome.
and if people want to find out more about this work that you've been doing, is there a place they can go?
All of our publications are on the Synapse website. I think that there will be a link in the notes here.
Did you bring a graph? You didn't show up at the nerd show without a graph, did you?
I did not. Figure 4 in our report here shows the revenues, which are the green bars for each of the utilities, relative to the different costs that electric vehicles are imposing. You can see that the biggest costs tend to be energy and generation capacity, but also electric vehicle programs from the utilities. There have been a lot of programs that have been approved over the past decade, and those are starting to hit rates. And so those obviously increase the costs that electric vehicles are imposing on the grid. But we see that the revenues from the last decade far exceed the costs in every scenario. So there's still a lot of headroom there for additional electric vehicle programs or for simply using those excess revenues to reduce rates for all customers.
If these homes with EV charging also put solar on the roof, does that make things better or worse in this regard, or is it complicated?
That's complicated. How much are they getting paid for the solar? So in terms of rate impacts, it's complicated and it depends on the structure that's in place to compensate homeowners for the solar generation that they provide. But in general, solar is displacing fossil fuels, and so that's beneficial because as the grid becomes more renewable, less emitting resources are used, that means that the greenhouse gas emissions of electric vehicles continue to fall. And we know that electric vehicles already reduce greenhouse gas emissions because the electric grid is cleaner than burning gasoline in your car. And that is increasingly the case all across the country. So the more renewables that we can get on the grid to help provide the energy that electric vehicles are using, the better for the environment.
I'm pretty sure we're charging our EVs at night and that our solar panel is producing more electricity during the day.
Yeah, and in California, there's so much solar on the grid in the middle of the day that charging your electric vehicle in California during the middle of the day is probably the best thing that you can do because it's low cost and it's low emissions. So that's a perfect marriage there.
Awesome.
Why are you doing the study in California specifically?
Well, California has the most electric vehicles in the nation. And so we've been tracking electric vehicles there for quite a while. They've also launched a bunch of initiatives to support electric vehicles that are also funded through utility ratepayer funds. So those programs get put into rates. And there's been a lot of concern about whether all the money that we're putting into electric vehicles and the cost that those electric vehicles are imposing on the grid if that is higher than the revenues that we're actually getting from electric vehicles when they're charging and then paying electricity rates. In terms of why we're interested in this, it's a big equity question. What are the impacts on non-electric vehicle owners? What impacts are electric vehicles having on other customers? And the California investor-owned utilities also put together great information about when electric vehicles are charging. So we have load profiles that we can analyze real-world data so that we understand the hours that electric vehicles are charging from the grid and potentially putting more strain on the grid. And we can look at how those hours align with the costs on the grid. California also has great data on the marginal costs of additional energy and capacity, transmission, distribution costs. So we can use that to really align the hourly costs that electric vehicles are imposing on the grid with the revenues that they're paying. And that's provided a lot of good data to do this analysis and find some very interesting results about the additional revenues that electric vehicles are contributing over costs.
Yeah, so for one thing, those additional revenues are enormous in this analysis.
They are. $1.7 billion, that's a lot of money over the past decade. And part of that is due to the rate structure in California that has historically had inclining block rates. So the more electricity you consume, the more you pay, the higher the rate you pay. So because electric vehicles consume quite a bit of electricity, somewhere in the range of 250 to 300 kilowatt hours on average per month. That increases the overall usage of customers and bumps them into a higher tier. And so those higher tiers are associated with higher rates, and that provides a lot of additional revenue. But we also looked at how electric vehicles contribute revenue and costs if they're on different types of rates, like time of use rates. And we ran a scenario where 75% of electric vehicles from 2012 to 2021 were on time of use rates. And on those rates, the rate changes throughout the day as costs on the grid change. So if electric vehicles are charging during off-peak hours, they're contributing a lot less in terms of revenue, but the costs that they're imposing on the grid are also less. And so we found that under that scenario, they're still contributing $1.4 billion more than the cost that they're imposing on the grid over the past decade.
Still a lot of money.
So with the time of use analysis, time of use rates presumably would change some of the timing, the behavior, and when people do charge their cars. Was that part of this historical analysis, or did you assume that people charged when they charged?
No, that is a big part of this analysis. And again, the investor-owned utilities in California have load curves for the electric vehicles that are charging on time of use rates that we were able to analyze and see that the vast majority of the charging takes place during off-peak hours. And so that's great for the grid. And electric vehicles are one of the easiest things to shift to off-peak hours. They're different than a typical appliance like your air conditioning that you turn on and you need that cool air right now. Electric vehicles, you don't really care when they charge, as long as they're charged when you're ready to go. But for most of the day, they sit in your garage or at work, and they can be charged whenever during that time. So electric vehicles tend to be really easy to charge overnight, which tends to be the off-peak hours for most utilities. And so that helps a lot in terms of reducing the costs on the grid.
Does revenue decoupling play a role here?
Well, revenue decoupling is a means of ensuring that utilities are collecting no more or no less than their allowed revenues. And so any excess revenue above utilities costs gets returned to customers right away. Under traditional regulation, utilities can increase their revenues between rate cases, and they don't have to necessarily return those additional revenues to customers. And so they can earn excess profits. When you have revenue decoupling, if sales change, for example, from a lot of additional electric vehicles, then the excess revenue earned from those additional sales gets passed back to customers pretty much right away. And so that helps reduce rates for all customers relative to what they would have been otherwise.
So does that mean that this $1.4 billion, that all of that goes back to ratepayers, not to shareholders?
it's complicated, right? Depending on what happens with other sales. If there are reductions in sales elsewhere, this might help fill that gap. But yes, that's the general idea, is that any excess revenues above costs get returned to ratepayers.
So my takeaway, tell me if I've got this right. One, we know electric vehicles are good for the environment because part of the long-term electrification and transformation of the sector and carbon emissions. We know that electric vehicles are great for the people who buy and drive them because they're just so fun and inexpensive and awesome for the owners. But then three, the question that this analysis gets at is, are there burdens placed on other electric consumers from, let's say rich people are buying EVs and charging them, and is that causing some subsidization or inequity? And what I take from this is that you're saying, at least in California, no, it's quite the opposite.
That's exactly right. And we don't know that the results of this analysis hold across every jurisdiction in the United States, because it could be that in some areas, when electric vehicle owners are charging their vehicles, aligns with the peak demand on the system, and that could really increase costs on the system. But we know that in California, that has not been the case. And especially now that California is transitioning to time of use rates as the default for residential customers, we expect to see a lot of electric vehicle charging during off-peak hours, even more so. And that'll help put downward pressure on rates for all customers.
So the rate structure really matters. And so is there any hope that we can go state by state and try to make sure that EVs and EV charging can have this kind of impact? I mean, not everybody has time of use rates, and there are lots of other complexities.
We actually recommend that states take a hard look at putting electric vehicle owners on time of use rates where that is feasible. Most states now have implemented advanced metering infrastructure where they can do time of use rates for residential customers very easily. And those rates tend to be appealing for electric vehicle owners because they charge very low rates during off-peak hours. And so it makes it even less expensive to fuel your electric vehicle, to charge your electric vehicle, because you're paying a very low rate during off-peak hours. But not all utilities offer time of use rates to their customers. And even where time of use rates are offered, sometimes the prices are not designed very well and they're not marketed to customers very well. So we see very low enrollment. So there's a lot that can be done to educate customers about the benefits of time of use rates, especially electric vehicle owners, and get them on those rates so that they can be charging during off-peak hours, paying low electricity rates, and imposing very little costs on the grid.
So with these benefits, I mean, there could be a lot more that happens, right? So I don't know if you know, but a few weeks ago, we had the folks from Cultura on the Nerd Show, and they studied super users of gas in California.
If we can get these biggest users of gasoline to switch to EVs first, it would take a lot fewer total EVs on the road to cut vehicle emissions in half. So just in California, if we could get the biggest users to switch first, we would need 9 million EVs on the road to cut emissions in half. And if the super users, the biggest users, switched last, as they're currently on track to do, it would take 24 million EVs on the road to cut vehicle emissions in half.
Yeah, at the national level, if super users go first, it's 98 million, and if they go last, it's like 235 million. And that's assuming that there's like 260 million light-duty vehicles on the road, which depends on definition. But if super users are last, that would be almost double our annual vehicle production in the U.S. for 10 years. So it would be it'd be a lot.
If we just took the top 10% of gas guzzling cars, not even off the road, but displace them to other average users and then displace them with EVs, that could cut emissions way more than 10%, maybe even 50% of transportation emissions. And so at the same time, that increase in EVs in California could lead to even lower rates, even more revenues being shared among ratepayers. So I don't know, it seems like California is such a proving ground for so many technologies and policies. Wouldn't it be great if they could kind of translate this study into more action on deploying EVs to super gas users?
Absolutely. And we've been looking at other states around the country and what's happening there and whether customers are on time of use rates. And we're seeing a lot of action at utility commissions looking at time of use rates and the potential benefits there. And we can look to California as a great example of how time of use rates really do work. Customers really do shift their load to off-peak hours. One of the challenges that we see with time of use rates is that most utilities require you to install a second meter if you want to charge your vehicle on a time of use rate and the rest of your household load on the regular rate. And the cost of that second meter is extremely high, and oftentimes you're also charged an additional monthly fee for that second meter. So a number of states, including Minnesota and New York, are looking at alternatives to installing a second meter through low-cost options like sub-metering. You can use vehicle telematics to provide the data on when vehicles are charging. You can also use external sub-meters such as level 2 networked chargers for getting the data on when the vehicle is charging. So there are multiple options that can be used that can also really encourage electric vehicle owners to take service on this rate because they know that they can easily shift their electric vehicle load. They might not be so excited about putting the rest of their household load on the time of use rate because the rest of their household load may be difficult to manage. But if we can at least get the electric vehicles on a time of use rate, then we know that that very large new load on the system is going to be primarily used during the off-peak hours, and that's going to benefit everybody.
So what would be required to do that? The Jeannie's Tesla would have to have some kind of technology to keep track of timing of charging and send that data to the utility in a form that the utility would trust that she wasn't hacking it or pretending she's charging at wrong times. And so reliable enough information from the car, certified by the third party or something. I'm trying to picture how that would work to satisfy these.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And a number of utilities are already using Tesla telematics that they're already built into the vehicle. Most new vehicles come with this feature to extract that data from the vehicle itself. There are some concerns about using vehicle telematics or level 2 chargers that are networked about whether that data is good enough for utility billing. There are really strict standards in place across the country for meters that measure electricity usage for billing purposes. And those standards were developed for traditional utility meters, not with electric vehicle charging infrastructure or telematics in mind. And the manufacturers today often are having a hard time meeting those extremely strict standards, but they can get close. And when we're talking about sub-metering, we're not talking about billing only the sub-meter data. That data also has to flow through the standard electric utility meter. So we know that the total amount of energy used at the site, at the customer's house, is going to be correct because we're using a utility grade meter to measure the total energy usage. It's just the portion that's being used by the electric vehicle that may not be able to comply with the extremely strict utility revenue grade metering standards. But maybe that's okay because we still have all the energy going through the utility meter at the end of the line. So some jurisdictions are making exceptions to the standards that apply to sub-metering and not imposing the same standards that apply to utility revenue grade meters. And California recently released an order where they adopted less stringent standards. And those standards will increase over time, but for the near term, they're a little bit less stringent, and that allows for this sub-metering to be conducted a lot more economically.
That's great. I think this is really positive news, and I hope that people will see it and think about it for their state, and hopefully some of the commissions and other people who can move regulation will really see, because it's a huge benefit. This can make things a lot easier for everyone.
Yes, I hope so.
Okay, thanks, Melissa, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.